History often turns on the smallest hinge. What if one of the most pivotal figures in American history, Abraham Lincoln, had never even taken office? Imagine an alternate timeline where the 16th president was assassinated before he was inaugurated. It's a dark twist on reality, one rooted in a real threat: the Baltimore Plot of 1861. The real plot that almost was. Before Abraham Lincoln even stepped into the White House, the country was already in turmoil. His election had thrown gasoline on the long-simmering fire between North and South. 7 southern states had seceded before he was even sworn in. His journey to the capital was fraught with danger, and it nearly ended in Baltimore. Railroad executives, worried by whispers of an assassination attempt in the pro-slavery stronghold of Baltimore, hired famed detective Allan Pinkerton. The Pinkerton Agency uncovered suspicious behavior, including plots to disrupt train lines or even mob attacks as Lincoln passed through. Though evidence was thin, tensions were high. Lincoln's response: a nighttime covert entry into Washington. Disguised in an overcoat and soft felt hat, he slipped through Baltimore under the cover of darkness on February 23, 1861, successfully evading a potential death. Newspapers mocked him for the cloak and dagger move, but history would later vindicate his caution. What if he had been killed? Now let's venture into alternate history. What if Pinkerton hadn't been hired? What if Lincoln hadn't been cautious? What if, on that February night in 1861, Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated before taking office? To understand the chaos that would unfold, remember this: the South didn't secede because of Lincoln's policies. They seceded because of what his election symbolized. Even his death wouldn't have magically soothed their grievances. The tensions that led to the Civil War were far deeper than one man. With Lincoln gone, the country would be left in a constitutional and political tailspin. Who takes over? At that time, presidential succession wasn't firmly codified. The 25th Amendment wouldn't arrive until 1967. Lincoln's vice president-elect, Hannibal Hamlin, might have seemed the obvious choice. But he wasn't even inaugurated yet. The current president, James Buchanan, would have remained in power until March 4th. But after that, enter the murky waters of the 1792 Presidential Succession Act. In this scenario, the next in line could have been the president pro tempore of the Senate, John C. Breckinridge, a Southern Democrat who won much of the South in the 1860 election. Breckinridge later joined the Confederacy in real life. Now picture that: a Confederate sympathizer assuming the presidency after Lincoln's assassination. The optics alone would ignite the North into a frenzy. The assassination of a president-elect by secessionist sympathizers would feel like Pearl Harbor, a brazen, unforgivable attack that united the North in rage and purpose. The man who could have led. But Breckinridge wouldn't have lasted long. Most likely, Congress and Northern political factions would have refused to accept him. Instead, they'd turn to someone like William H. Seward, Lincoln's biggest rival during the Republican nomination, and later, his Secretary of State. Seward was a political heavyweight, respected and connected. But as president, that's a different story. Seward had controversial ideas. He believed that to unify the country, the United States should provoke a war with a European power like Britain, France, or Spain. He thought a foreign war would distract the North and South from their internal divisions. He even proposed aggressive ultimatums to European nations mere months before Fort Sumter. In this alternate history, Seward ascends to the presidency in a wave of chaos. With the North incensed and the South emboldened, he might make a fateful decision: strike first. The Civil War begins, harder and bloodier. Unlike Lincoln, who strategically waited for the South to fire the first shot at Fort Sumter to gain moral high ground, Seward might opt for immediate retaliation. He would likely call up 100,000 volunteers, more than Lincoln's 75,000, and order a swift attack on Richmond, the Confederate capital. The resulting battle, perhaps a mega version of Bull Run, would be an utter disaster for the Union. With untrained troops rushing in and Confederate commanders like Robert E. Lee at their finest, the Union would face a humiliating defeat. This early loss would be more than military, it would be political. The North's fragile confidence in Seward would collapse. The South, flush with captured weapons and morale, would seize the momentum and push northward. Richmond falls, Washington. Next, with the Confederates energized, General Lee could do what was never achieved in our timeline: march directly into Washington, D.C. in 1861. The capital, barely defended after the Union's botched assault on Richmond, would be ripe for the taking. A Confederate flag flying over the White House wouldn't just be symbolic. It would represent a complete failure of the Union's leadership. Seward's legitimacy would evaporate. Congress might flee to Philadelphia. States like Kentucky and Missouri would fracture even more violently than they did in our timeline, with cities like Louisville and St. Louis becoming hotbeds of guerrilla warfare. Maryland, where Lincoln was killed, would suffer severe retribution under martial law. A fractured North and a gloating South. Internally, the North would be a mess. Lincoln, though unpopular with many during his presidency, had a unique ability to unify opposing factions when it counted. Seward, on the other hand, would struggle with moderates, radicals, and anti-war Democrats, each pulling in different directions. His willingness to compromise on civil liberties and censorship would alienate both sides. As the Union government retreated and reeled, the Confederacy might even attempt to negotiate recognition from European powers. Foreign eyes watch America burn. France and Britain were already watching the Civil War with great interest in real history. British Prime Minister Palmerston was no fan of the United States. While officially anti-slavery, he believed that a fractured U.S. would benefit British influence and trade. Though British reliance on southern cotton is often overstated, they had India and Egypt. They did value northern corn and trade routes. However, a victorious Confederacy seizing Washington might shift the calculus. British and French investment in the South, particularly with dreams of an empire stretching into Latin America, could make the Confederacy a legitimate global player. The South's big dreams. The Confederacy had dreams beyond simply surviving. Some leaders envisioned expanding into Mexico and Central America to form a golden circle of slave-holding territories. Agents were already active in Mexico, fomenting revolt. With the North in retreat and European backing plausible, the South might have had the means to act. And with new industrial opportunities, slavery might not die out naturally. It might have evolved, or worsened. An American tragedy in the making. In this timeline, the death of Abraham Lincoln doesn't just change who's in charge. It changes everything. A rushed war, a premature battle, and poor leadership turn what was already a national tragedy into a possible Confederate victory. The Union, lacking direction and unity, loses both cities and morale. Foreign powers inch closer to recognition of the South. The American experiment, still young, fractures before it has a chance to prove itself. And all of it starts not at Fort Sumter, but at the train station in Baltimore. And that's it for today's dive into alternate history. What if Lincoln had been assassinated before becoming president? If you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like, drop a comment with your own theories, and subscribe for more mind-bending alternate timelines and historical twists.